Under the golden glow of the setting sun, the village of Nyanga hummed with the rhythm of life. Thatched roof huts lined the dusty pathways, their mud walls painted with intricate patterns passed down through generations. Children ran barefoot, their laughter echoing through the air as they played near the communal well. Women, draped in vibrant fabrics, carried baskets filled with freshly harvested yams, their voices weaving together in melodious conversation. The men sat in a circle beneath the great baobab tree, carving tools and sharing stories of ancestors and spirits. The scent of roasting maize filled the air, mingling with the sweet aroma of the night-blooming flowers that adorned the village borders. Among them was Adina, a young woman whose wisdom and strength set her apart. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her eyes keen and observant. Raised by her grandmother, the village's most respected storyteller, Adina had learned the art of discernment, the value of patience and the weight of responsibility. Her voice, though gentle, commanded respect, and her heart, though kind, was not easily swayed. She had rejected many suitors, choosing instead to spend her days tending to the village's medicinal garden, helping the elders and teaching the young ones the tales of old. One evening, as the villagers gathered around the fire to share their nightly stories, a stranger arrived. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his presence commanding yet oddly silent. His garments were unlike anything the villagers had seen, dark, embroidered with symbols that seemed to shift under the flickering light. His eyes, deep and unreadable, carried the weight of unseen burdens. He introduced himself as Kamari, a wandering warrior who had traveled from distant lands. His voice was smooth, each word measured, carrying an air of mystery that both intrigued and unsettled the villagers. He spoke of the dangers that lurked beyond the village, of unseen threats that could strike in the dead of night. He had come, he claimed, to offer his protection, to stand as a guardian against whatever darkness loomed beyond the borders of Nyanga. The elders, wise and cautious, listened but did not immediately accept him. Strangers had passed through before, but none had spoken with such certainty, such an air of quiet authority. Yet it was Adina who found herself drawn to him. There was something about Kamari, his demeanor, his unwavering gaze, that fascinated her. He was different from the men she had known, different from the eager suitors who sought her attention. He did not flatter her, nor did he try to impress her with grand gestures. Instead he listened. He spoke to her not as a man seeking favor but as an equal. Still, whispers of doubt fluttered like restless leaves in the wind. The village's oldest elder, Mama Jaha, watched Kamari with wary eyes, her lips pressed into a thin line. The hunter's hounds, usually friendly, growled when he passed. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in his presence, but Adina dismissed these thoughts. She was not one to judge a man by superstition alone. After all, Kamari had done nothing to warrant suspicion, only offered his strength, his presence, and his protection. Kamari quickly became a familiar presence in Nyanga. In the days that followed his arrival, he proved himself useful in ways that made the villagers warm up to him. He helped reinforce the wooden fences that protected their livestock, carried heavy sacks of grain from the fields, and even mended the broken spear of the village's best hunter. His strength was undeniable, his skill with weapons unmatched, and his willingness to serve without asking for anything in return earned him admiration. When a wild hyena crept too close to the village one night, it was Kamari who chased it away, his blade gleaming under the moonlight. The elders nodded in approval and the men of the village clapped him on the back. He had come as a stranger, but now he was becoming one of them. Adina, too, found herself growing closer to him. Though she had once been cautious, she now sought his company more and more. At night, when the village rested and the sky was strewn with stars, she and Kamari would sit by the dying embers of the fire and talk. She shared stories of her childhood, of the lessons her grandmother had taught her, of the legends that had been passed down for generations. Kamari listened intently, his gaze never leaving hers, as if memorizing every word. And then, slowly, he began to share as well, though only in fragments. He spoke of battles fought in distant lands, of long, lonely journeys where he had no home to return to. There was a sadness in his voice, a heaviness in his silence. When Adina pressed him for more, he would shake his head and say, "Some pasts are better left buried." Despite his secrecy, Adina felt a deepening connection to him. There was a gentleness beneath his hardened exterior, a quiet sorrow she wished she could understand. He was unlike any man she had ever met, strong yet thoughtful, reserved yet kind. The way he spoke to her, the way he listened, made her feel seen in a way she never had before. But not everyone shared her growing affection. The village elders watched from a distance, their eyes filled with concern. One evening Mama Jaha, the wisest among them, pulled Adina aside. "Child," she said, her voice heavy with warning, "we have lived long enough to know that not all who come bearing gifts come with good intentions. Be careful where you place your trust." Adina smiled reassuringly. "Kamari has done nothing but help us, Mama Jaha. He has proven himself time and time again." Mama Jaha sighed, resting a weathered hand on Adina's shoulder. "Even the most beautiful river can run deep with hidden dangers." Adina nodded respectfully but brushed off the warning. She had seen nothing but kindness in Kamari. She believed in his goodness, in the protection he promised. In her heart, she began to imagine a future where he remained by her side, a life where she was no longer just the village healer but the wife of a warrior, a man who could stand beside her against all odds. She did not know that the very night sky they sat beneath, the very shadows that stretched around them, whispered of a truth yet to be revealed. The peace that had settled over Nyanga after Kamari's arrival began to unravel in ways that were too subtle at first to draw much attention. But the signs were there. It started with the animals. Chickens, goats, and even a prized hunting dog vanished without a trace. No blood, no tracks, just silence where once there had been life. At first, the villagers blamed wild animals, perhaps a cunning leopard or a desperate hyena. But the disappearances grew more frequent, and an unsettling pattern emerged. The animals went missing only on nights when the moon was at its highest, when the wind carried an eerie whisper through the trees. Then came the sounds. At first, they were distant, low, mournful howls that could have belonged to wolves, though no wolves had ever been known to roam those lands. The villagers dismissed it, but as the nights passed, the howls grew closer, more persistent, threading through the air like voices calling from unseen realms. Mothers pulled their children indoors earlier than usual, elders sat outside their huts with wary eyes scanning the darkness, and the hunters sharpened their spears, waiting for a threat they could not yet name. Adina was the first to notice Kamari's strange behavior. He began disappearing from the village at odd hours, slipping away into the night with no explanation. When she questioned him, he only smiled, brushing her concerns aside with vague reassurances. "There are things I must do," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You have nothing to fear." But she did fear. There was something different about him when he returned from these mysterious excursions. His presence, once warm and protective, carried a chilling undercurrent. His eyes, always deep and thoughtful, seemed darker, almost hollow, as if he carried shadows within him. His movements, once fluid and strong, became measured, cautious, as though he was always aware of something unseen. One night Adina followed him. Wrapped in a cloak to shield herself from the cool night air, she crept through the village, keeping her distance as Kamari walked toward the outskirts. She trailed him past the fields and into the dense forest, her heartbeat quickening with every step. Finally she stopped, pressing herself against the rough bark of an ancient tree as she watched him from a distance. He stood in the clearing, the moon casting silver light upon him. He raised his arms, his head tilted back, and then he spoke, but not in any language Adina had ever heard. The words poured from his lips in a haunting rhythm, guttural and sharp, carrying a weight that made the air feel heavier. It was as if he was not speaking to himself, but to something beyond, something unseen. The wind stirred violently, whipping through the trees in response. The leaves rustled, and the shadows seemed to stretch and coil unnaturally as though listening. Adina's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to step forward to call out to him, but fear held her in place. The next morning she could not bring herself to meet his gaze. When he spoke to her, his voice was as smooth as ever, but she could not shake the memory of the language he had spoken, the feeling that she had witnessed something she was never meant to see. Her unease grew when an elder shaman arrived unexpectedly, summoned by the village's most senior council members. His hair was silver, his face lined with age, and his eyes held the weight of countless visions. He did not waste time with greetings. Instead, he sought out Adina and took her hands in his. His grip was strong, his fingers cold. "You must listen carefully, child," he murmured. "I have seen the signs. The spirits whisper of a darkness that walks among us, wearing the face of a man." Adina's chest tightened. "What are you saying?" The shaman's gaze did not waver. "You must be careful. Shadows coil around him and they hunger. If you do not act wisely, you will bring ruin upon yourself and those you love." She pulled her hands away, shaking her head. "Kamari has done nothing wrong." The shaman sighed, a weary sound that carried years of knowing. "Evil does not always announce itself, Adina. Sometimes it comes dressed as a savior." That night, as the village prepared for rest, a young boy came running through the narrow paths between the huts, his face pale with fear. "I saw it," he cried, his small hands trembling as he clung to his mother. "I saw his shadow move on its own." The villagers gathered, murmuring in confusion. "Who, child?" an elder asked. The boy pointed toward the edge of the village, toward the place where Kamari stood in the fading light. "Him." A hush fell over the crowd. Kamari said nothing, his expression unreadable. He did not deny it, nor did he attempt to defend himself. He simply met Adina's gaze, his eyes dark pools of something she could no longer understand. And for the first time, doubt crept into her heart. The night was darker than usual, the moon barely peeking through the thick canopy of the ancient trees. A strange silence filled the air, broken only by the occasional rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush. Adina moved carefully, her footsteps light against the forest floor. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but she forced herself forward, each step fueled by the gnawing doubt that had settled in her mind. She had to know the truth. For weeks she had ignored the warnings, the strange disappearances, the elder's vision, the boy's terrified whispers. She had convinced herself that love could not be deceived, that the man she had come to cherish was exactly who he claimed to be. But after seeing Kamari speak that eerie, unearthly language to the wind, she could no longer silence the unease creeping into her bones. And so she followed him. Ahead of her, Kamari walked with purpose, slipping through the trees like a shadow. He moved differently now, more fluid, almost unnatural in his grace. He did not carry a lantern, yet he navigated the darkness with ease as if the night itself welcomed him. Adina stayed hidden, moving between trees, her breath shallow. He did not seem to sense her presence, or perhaps he did not care. He reached a clearing, one she had never seen before, though she had lived in Nyanga her entire life. The space was unnatural, the trees bending inward, their twisted roots curling like fingers grasping for something unseen. The air was thick, heavy with something she could not name. Kamari stepped into the center of the clearing and lifted his hands. A gust of wind surged through the trees, though the night had been still only moments before. The leaves rustled in response, whispering secrets she could not understand. Then he spoke. The words were the same as before, harsh, guttural, ancient. They carried power, an eerie rhythm that sent shivers racing down Adina's spine. But this time she did not look away. As the wind howled around him, Kamari tilted his head back. A strange glow flickered around him, and then, before her very eyes, his form began to change. Adina gasped, slapping a hand over her mouth to stifle the sound. Kamari's skin rippled like water, shifting and stretching. His once human hands elongated, his fingers sharpening into something claw-like. His back arched unnaturally, his limbs bending at impossible angles. His dark eyes, which had once been filled with warmth when he looked at her, now glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. His features twisted, his mouth stretching into a wide, jagged grin that did not belong to any man. He was shedding his human skin. A monstrous form emerged, a creature not of flesh and blood but of shadows and spirit. His body flickered between solid and smoke, his presence both there and not. The Kamari she had loved was gone, replaced by something ancient and terrible. A chorus of voices echoed around him, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. The spirits of the night had gathered, swirling like a dark mist, whispering his name. "You have done well, brother," one voice hissed, slithering through the air like a serpent. "The girl suspects," another voice murmured. "She watches." Adina's blood ran cold. They knew she was there. Kamari turned sharply, his glowing eyes scanning the darkness. For a moment she swore his gaze landed on her, piercing through the shadows where she hid. Her body tensed, every muscle screaming for her to run. But she couldn't, not yet. She needed to hear it from him. "I have them under my spell," Kamari said, his voice distorted, layered as if spoken by more than one being. "The villagers trust me. They believe in my strength. Soon they will be defenseless." A ripple of dark laughter spread through the gathering spirits. "And the girl?" one asked. "What of her?" Pause. Then Kamari's grin widened. "She is a fool like all the others. She believes I am her protector, that I will stand by her side." His laughter was cold, void of the warmth Adina had once loved. "But she is merely a pawn, a means to an end." The word stabbed through her like a blade. Her heart clenched, her breath caught in her throat. She had given him her trust, her admiration, even the beginnings of her love, and he had only seen her as a tool to be used. She staggered backward, a twig snapping beneath her foot. Kamari's head snapped toward her. For a second neither of them moved. The air between them was thick with tension, crackling like a storm about to break. Then the shadows lunged. Adina turned and ran. Branches tore at her skin, roots threatened to trip her, but she did not stop. Her breath came in short, desperate gasps, her pulse hammering in her ears. Behind her, the whispers grew louder, the voices of the spirits shrieking through the trees. She runs. She knows. She cannot leave. The wind howled, pressing against her like unseen hands trying to hold her back. Kamari, a spirit's voice hissed. Stop her. Footsteps thundered behind her, faster, heavier. He was coming. Adina forced herself forward, pushing past the burning in her legs. She could see the edge of the forest now, the faint glow of the village's fires flickering in the distance. If she could just reach them, if she could warn the others. A clawed hand swiped at her, missing by inches. Adina screamed, throwing herself forward. Her foot caught on a root and she stumbled, crashing onto the forest floor. Pain shot through her palms, but she had no time to dwell on it. She scrambled forward, her fingers digging into the dirt, desperate to escape. Kamari, please, she gasped, turning to look at him one last time. What she saw was not the man she had fallen for. He stood there, towering over her, his monstrous form fully revealed. His eyes burned like embers, his mouth twisted into something both cruel and hungry. His hands flexed, claws curling in anticipation. For a moment she thought he might strike. But then he hesitated. A flicker of something passed through his glowing eyes. Recognition? Regret? Or was it just another trick? Adina did not wait to find out. She turned and bolted, her feet pounding against the dirt. The village was close now, the flickering torchlights growing larger. She burst through the trees, stumbling into the open, her breath ragged. The villagers, startled by her sudden appearance, turned to her with wide eyes. Kamari, she gasped, pointing back at the forest. He's not human. The words barely left her lips before the wind surged once more. The villagers turned their gaze toward the trees, where the darkness loomed like an open maw, waiting. And Kamari was nowhere to be seen. The village square buzzed with the warm glow of firelight, the comforting sounds of life continuing as if nothing had changed. But for Adina nothing was the same. Her breath was ragged, her heart a frantic drumbeat in her chest as she stood before her people, trying to force the words past her trembling lips. Kamari is not who he says he is, she cried, her voice breaking through the murmur of evening conversations. He is a deceiver, a creature of the night hiding in human skin. The villagers, startled by her outburst, exchanged glances of confusion. Some gasped in shock while others frowned in disbelief. Kamari stepped forward from the shadows, his presence as commanding as ever. His expression was one of deep hurt, his golden eyes brimming with sorrow. Adina, he said softly, his voice a perfect blend of concern and patience. You are exhausted, frightened. You must rest. The crowd murmured in agreement. She had burst in from the forest, wild-eyed and panting. It was easy for them to believe she was simply overwhelmed by fear. I know what I saw. Adina insisted, gripping the edge of her shawl as though it could steady her. I followed him into the forest. I saw him shed his human form. He is not one of us. A few villagers shifted uncomfortably, but most looked to Kamari for an explanation. He sighed, shaking his head as if burdened by a heavy grief. This is what I feared, he murmured. The spirits of the night play tricks on the mind. They whisper lies. They twist what is real. I would never harm this village, Adina. You know that. His voice was calm, reassuring. The very same voice that had once made her trust him so deeply. And now it was being used against her. She is afraid, he continued, turning to the villagers. And fear makes us see things that are not there. A wave of uncertainty rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, casting sympathetic glances at Adina. Others hesitated, watching her carefully. Adina clenched her fists. You're lying. Kamari took a step toward her, his movements slow, deliberate. I would never lie to you, Adina. His eyes glowed ever so slightly in the firelight. That was all it took for the elders, those who had lived long enough to recognize hidden danger, to exchange glances. They were not yet convinced of Adina's claims, but something in Kamari's presence now unsettled them. One of them, an old woman named Nyaka, leaned on her staff. Perhaps it would not hurt to seek the shaman's wisdom, she said slowly. A sacred ritual to confirm that all is well. Kamari smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. If that will ease your worries, I welcome it. The villagers nodded, relieved. The shaman was the keeper of Nyanga's deepest truths, the bridge between the mortal world and the spirits. If anyone could confirm what was real, it was him. The shaman arrived shortly after, a tall, thin man with skin like carved ebony and eyes that seemed to see through time itself. He carried a bowl of sacred herbs, his movements slow and measured as he stepped into the center of the village. The flames in the fire pit flickered unnaturally as he approached. "Come forward," the shaman said, his voice deep and commanding. Kamari did not hesitate. He stepped into the ritual circle without resistance, standing tall as if he had nothing to hide. The shaman crushed the herbs in his palm, whispering words in the ancient tongue. Smoke curled from his fingers, spiraling into the air, wrapping around Kamari like unseen hands. The villagers watched in silence, the tension thick enough to smother. Adina held her breath. The wind shifted. The fire dimmed. And then, the smoke recoiled. A sharp, unnatural hiss filled the air, as though the very earth was rejecting the presence before it. The shaman's eyes widened. "You do not belong here," he whispered. A chill ran through the villagers. Kamari's smile faltered. A ripple spread through his skin, subtle but unmistakable. His breath hitched for just a moment, his form flickering, like a mirage struggling to hold its shape. Gasps rose from the crowd. Mothers clutched their children. The elders took cautious steps back. "No," one of them breathed. Kamari straightened, rolling his shoulders as if shedding an invisible weight. His golden eyes, once warm, now burned like fire. "I had hoped to end this peacefully," he murmured. Then his body twisted. A terrible sound filled the air, the sound of bones shifting, skin stretching, something unnatural breaking free. His form swelled, stretching beyond human proportions. His hands elongated into clawed talons, his mouth stretching wider than any mortal's should. His once beautiful features dissolved into something monstrous. His cloak billowed, though there was no wind, twisting into shadowy tendrils that slithered through the air. The villagers screamed. He was no warrior, no protector. He was something ancient, something cursed. And he was angry. With a guttural growl, Kamari turned on them. His form flickered between solid and mist, his limbs stretching and curling in ways no human body could. The village erupted into chaos. People scrambled away, knocking over baskets and scattering embers from the fire. The elders tried to gather the people, calling for calm, but Kamari let out a furious roar, the sound shaking the ground beneath them. Shadows writhed around him, creeping toward the villagers. But the shaman did not move. He remained where he stood, his face unshaken, his hands steady. His fingers traced symbols in the dirt, his voice rising above the chaos. The ancient words of power filled the air. The shadows around Kamari recoiled. His monstrous form snarled in response, twisting violently as if resisting an unseen force. He lunged at the shaman, his claws slicing through the air, but an invisible barrier stopped him. A sharp flash of light erupted from the ritual circle, sending Kamari stumbling backward. He roared, his form flickering, unstable. The shaman's chant deepened, the power in his voice undeniable. The villagers, once paralyzed by fear, saw their chance. They grabbed weapons, spears, staffs, whatever they could find. The elders drew sacred symbols in the dirt, strengthening the barrier. Kamari bared his jagged teeth. "You cannot stop me." The shaman's gaze did not waver. Adina stepped forward. "You lied to me," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. Kamari's expression twisted, something like regret flickering in his monstrous eyes. But it was gone in an instant. "You were never meant to know," he hissed. The shaman slammed his staff against the ground. The symbols around them flared to life, glowing with an unearthly power. The wind roared. The earth trembled. "Kamari," the shaman intoned, his voice ringing through the night, "your deception ends now." The ritual had begun. The village trembled under the weight of the night's unfolding horror. Kamari, no longer the charming warrior who had once won their trust, stood in his true form, a towering, shadowy figure, his golden eyes burning like twin embers in the darkness. His monstrous limbs twisted unnaturally, tendrils of darkness writhing around him like living things. The villagers, though terrified, refused to flee. They had lived in harmony for generations, bound by their ancestors' wisdom and the strength of their unity. Now they would stand together against the betrayer. The shaman stepped forward, his staff crackling with energy. His deep voice rose above the chaos, chanting words of old, calling upon the spirits of their forefathers. The wind howled in response, stirring the flames of the village torches into a defiant dance. "Form the circle," he commanded. The villagers obeyed without hesitation. They grabbed chalky white stones from the sacred shrine and traced protective symbols onto the ground. These symbols, passed down through generations, were said to ward off dark spirits. The circle was their shield, their last defense. Kamari sneered. Do you think these feeble signs will stop me? He raised his arms, and the shadows around him coiled tighter, growing in size and strength. With a wave of his clawed hand, a chilling wind swept through the village, snuffing out torches, plunging half the square into an eerie darkness. Adina gritted her teeth, her heart pounding, but she did not step back. She had been fooled once by Kamari's deceitful charm, she would not be fooled again. The shaman continued his chant, his voice unwavering. The sacred symbols began to glow with a faint light, humming with ancestral power. Kamari roared and struck forward. His shadowy tendrils lashed against the invisible barrier formed by the circle, but the light repelled them, sending him staggering back. He snarled in frustration. You think your ancestors can save you? He slammed his clawed fist into the earth, and the ground shuddered. From the cracks in the soil, dark figures slithered forth, creatures with hollow eyes and skeletal fingers, spirits long trapped in the depths of the unknown. They whispered in voices that did not belong to the living. The villagers gasped. The battle had truly begun. Armed with nothing but their unity and the shaman's ancient knowledge, the villagers fought back. They threw sacred herbs into the fire, thickening the air with protective smoke. They beat their drums, the deep vibrations pushing back against the dark spirits. Warriors wielded spears marked with the elders' symbols, striking at the creeping shadows, forcing them to retreat. But Kamari was relentless. He fought like a beast unleashed, his movements faster than the eye could follow. His laughter echoed through the night as he swiped at the villagers, forcing them to stumble backward. Adina's mind raced. There had to be another way. The shaman was holding his own, but Kamari's power was growing. If the battle dragged on, the village might not withstand the onslaught. Then she remembered a story. An old legend her grandmother had once told her as a child. A tale of a trickster spirit, one that thrived on deception but could be trapped if it was outwitted. Kamari, she called out, stepping past the protective circle. Gasps rang out behind her, but she ignored them. Kamari turned, his monstrous grin widening. Ah, my dear Adina, he mocked. Do you finally accept my power? She lifted her chin. You claim to be powerful, but I see only a coward. The grin faltered. What did you say? You hide behind tricks and shadows. You deceive rather than fight with honor. If you are truly strong, then prove it. Kamari's monstrous form flickered, uncertainty creeping into his burning gaze. Spirits of his kind were vain, easily provoked by challenges to their dominance. Adina took another step forward. A true warrior does not fear his own name, she continued, her voice unwavering. Yet you have hidden yours from us. The villagers stirred. This was true, no one had ever heard Kamari speak his real name. The shaman's eyes widened, understanding Adina's plan. He raised his staff, his voice joining hers. Spirits that conceal their names can be bound if they are named aloud. Kamari's expression twisted with rage. Silence, he roared, but his form flickered again, the stability of his shape faltering. Adina took a deep breath. The name. It was buried in the ancient stories, whispered by the elders in the past. She reached deep into her memories, pulling the legend to the surface. And then it came to her. Your name, she said, her voice ringing across the village, is Kamandu, the deceiver of the night. A howl ripped through the air, piercing and unnatural. The moment the name left her lips, the ground beneath Kamari trembled. His monstrous form convulsed, his shadows pulling inward, as though something unseen was yanking at his very essence. The shaman acted instantly. Now, he commanded. The villagers hurled sacred dust into the air, and the symbols around the circle flared to life, their glow intensifying until the night itself seemed to push away from them. Kamari, Kamandu, clawed at his chest, his body twisting. No, he bellowed. This is not how it ends. But it was. The shaman slammed his staff into the earth, and a brilliant light erupted from the circle. The tendrils of shadow that had wrapped around the village recoiled violently. The spirits Kamari had summoned let out wails of agony before vanishing into the void from which they came. Kamari's body cracked like shattered glass, dark energy leaking from within. His monstrous roar turned into a strangled whisper as his essence was sucked into the symbols drawn in the dirt. Adina did not look away. She watched as the betrayer was sealed away, his presence erased from the land he had tried to deceive. Then silence. The air cleared. The village, though shaken, was intact. the torches reignited. The people, one by one, slowly emerged from their places of shelter, staring in disbelief at the empty space where Kamari had once stood. Adina let out a breath she had been holding. It was over. The shaman turned to her, eyes filled with both exhaustion and pride. "You have done what many could not," he said. "You have outwitted a trickster and saved your people." The villagers, now free of the darkness, erupted into cheers, embracing one another in relief. Kamari, no Kamandu, was gone. And Adina, once deceived by his false kindness, had been the one to banish him. The village stood in the golden light of dawn, the horrors of the night slowly fading into the past. The air was thick with both relief and sorrow, as families gathered in the village square, tending to one another, ensuring that no one had been lost. Though they had emerged victorious, the weight of betrayal hung over them like an unspoken shadow. Adina stood near the center of it all, her gaze sweeping over the people she had fought to protect. The elders whispered among themselves, shaking their heads at the magnitude of what had occurred. Children clung to their mothers, their wide eyes still filled with fear from the events of the night before. The warriors, usually so strong and fearless, moved with quiet reverence, their weapons still gripped tightly in their hands, as if expecting the darkness to return at any moment. Despite their survival, the pain of deception lingered. The shaman approached Adina, his old eyes filled with both wisdom and sympathy. "You have done well, child," he said. "But I see the burden in your heart." Adina met his gaze, her voice quiet but steady. "I trusted him," she admitted. "I believed in his kindness, his promises. And yet, he was never what he claimed to be." The shaman nodded solemnly. "Deception is a powerful weapon, one that preys on hope and trust. You were not the only one deceived, he fooled us all. But it is not trust that is the weakness, it is the blindness that sometimes accompanies it." Adina let his words settle, realizing the truth in them. The village had been vulnerable not because they had been too trusting, but because they had ignored the warnings of those who saw the danger lurking beneath the surface. As the morning sun rose higher, the villagers began to rebuild, physically and emotionally. The elders gathered the people and spoke of the lessons learned. "Evil does not always arrive with a snarl and a threat," one of them said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "Sometimes it wears a smile. Sometimes it speaks words of comfort and love. But we must always listen to the voices of wisdom, to the whispers of our ancestors who guide us." Mothers held their children close, whispering prayers of protection over them. Young warriors exchanged glances, vowing to be more vigilant in the future. The story of Kamari, no Kamandu, was already becoming legend, a warning to future generations. That night, the village held a ceremony, not of mourning but of remembrance. They lit lanterns and sent them into the sky, watching as they floated like tiny stars, carrying their prayers to the spirits above. The drums beat in a slow, steady rhythm, grounding them in the strength of their ancestors. Adina stood at the edge of the gathering, looking toward the horizon. She knew that this was a turning point for her. She had faced darkness and survived, not with brute force but with wisdom and courage. She had been deceived, but she had also learned. She took a deep breath, feeling the strength that had always been within her. This was not the end of her story, it was the beginning of something new. And with that, Adina stepped forward, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead.